Hello everyone, and welcome to this YouTube tutorial about how to answer question 3 of your paper 1 media messages media exam. This is going to take you through how to answer question 3, which is worth 10 marks, and you should spend about 15 minutes on it. You're going to need a pen, paper, and probably a browser tab open with a new blog post on it, because that's where you're going to do some of your writing. And if you want to send the evidence of this lesson to your teachers, you can do it on a blog post and then send them the address and they can check what you've done. That's probably the easiest thing to do. So hopefully you've had a good look at question 1 and 2 with your previous lessons. This question is going to focus on how contexts impact production, distribution, and circulation. Incorrectly spelled there, sorry about that, in the newspaper industry, using examples from your own information from the Daily Mail and the Guardian newspapers that you should have studied. It's worth 10 marks. And there's a lot of information that can go in here, so hopefully through these tutorials I'll be able to sort of hone in on the things that you do need to know, the non-negotiables, which will help you write your essay. So here's an example of the sort of question you might get. Explain how the political context in which newspapers are produced influences their ownership and regulation. Refer to the Guardian and the Daily Mail newspapers you've studied to support your answer. Pause the video here and just consider this question. How does it make you feel? Are you terrified by this? Does it make you feel a little bit sick? In fact, have you just been sick all over your keyboard? I hope you haven't. If you have, now's the time to pause the video, wipe up the vomit from your in between the K and the J keys, and just see how would you go about answering this question. So pause the video here. Okay, so hopefully you've cleaned up your keyboard now and you've had a time to wipe the sweat from your brow. This is the sort of question that you're going to get. Let's just have a quick look through it. Explain how the political context in which newspapers are produced influences their ownership and regulation. Refer to these two newspapers. So the first thing to say is don't panic. That's the first thing. Let's think about what this question's asking you, or what the question could ask you. So it focuses on the knowledge and understanding, and if you looked at the other videos that I've produced, knowledge and understanding is AO1. It's just about what you know, how much stuff you have done in class and at home of newspaper production or distribution. There is no analysis here, so you don't need to look at a newspaper and talk about the media language in a newspaper that's been given to you. There's no analysis here, so essentially it's testing what you have learned beforehand. So the papers that you've studied, and having a good bank of knowledge available at your fingertips is crucial to the success of you answering this question well. Now, this question can be about any context. This particular one's about political contexts, but it could be about social contexts, cultural contexts, political or economic contexts. So there's quite a wide range of things this could be. So it sort of makes sense to me, if that is the case, that we start to think about all the permutations of what it could be, which context we can talk about. So what I need you to do is get a blank piece of paper. I don't think this is an accurate table, because you're going to have to write a lot more in these boxes, but essentially you need to make these headings: macro, economic, political, cultural, and social. So those are all of the possible outcomes that this question could be, and we're going to go through each of them now. And as we go through each of them, please take your time. You can pause this video whenever you want to make your notes as thorough as possible. Like I said, it's probably best if you do put this in a new blog post so your teachers can check that you're doing the right thing. Okay, so here we go. Let's start. And we're always going to start with the macro. With all these questions, we need to think big picture. So this infographic may be familiar to you, it may not be, but essentially it shows all of the owners of the UK newspaper industry. Now, you might need to pause this and zoom in on a few of them, but essentially what it's showing you is which people or which companies own which titles. So here we've got Lord Rothermere up here, who is the chairman of the DMGT group. They own the Mail, they own the Metro, and they've recently acquired the Eye. Reach plc, who's responsible for the Star, the Express, and the Mirror. Rupert Murdoch, who is the chairman of News Corporation, they own the Times and the Sun. The Sun obviously is the UK's most popular newspaper. So what's important for you to recognize are these numbers here. So it's the readership share or the market share that these three companies have of the UK newspaper industry. And if you add all of these three together, these numbers, you get 80%. So this means that these three companies, just three companies, own 80% of the UK newspaper market. And when an industry is dominated by a few small companies, we call this an oligopoly. A monopoly would be one. An oligopoly is a couple or a number of companies owning the majority of the stake. If we go below this, the Scott Trust, which you know owns The Guardian, or is responsible for The Guardian, it only has a 10% share or 11% share. So we're really saying that The Guardian isn't one of the big players. It's got a smaller readership than the other three companies. But you must be aware that the market is dominated by these three companies. They are majority right-wing publications, although there's a few there that are left-wing with the Eye, for example. But what you need to be aware of is that three companies own 80% of the UK newspaper market. If you get a question, that's how you should start. So that's where your first note goes. So to add to your macro notes, you need to be aware of the state of the UK newspaper industry. So to add to those notes, you're going to say something like, the job of the press is to hold powerful institutions, including politicians, to account. That's why the press is there. And to be the eyes and the ears of the public in places the public cannot be. Very few of the members of the public can go to the House of Lords, can go to the House of Commons, and therefore it's the press's responsibility to reflect what's going on behind closed doors. Now, this is very important. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. The Leveson Inquiry was launched to investigate the culture, practices, and ethics of the British press following the phone hacking scandal. It explored the links between the press and the police and politicians, as well as tactics used to get stories. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but it's important that you understand that the Leveson Inquiry was launched. We can't talk about the newspaper industry without referring to the Leveson Inquiry. As a result of the Leveson Inquiry, two main regulators now uphold press standards: the government-backed Impress and the industry-accepted IPSO. So there are two regulators, one called Impress, one called IPSO, and I'll talk about those now. Important that you are familiar with the Leveson Inquiry. Now's the time to jog your memory using these two videos here. So the first video is a video about the Leveson Inquiry. It's from CNN. So what you need to do is you need to Google CNN Explain It to Me UK tabloid scandal, and this young lady will talk through the Leveson Inquiry. And the second one, and the second link you need to click is this one here, which is a BBC link, and what you need to do is type in the story behind the phone hacking conspiracy, BBC News. There are two videos for you to watch. Pause this video, watch those videos now, and take a few quick notes. Okay, so hopefully that's familiarized you with the Leveson Inquiry. The reason why it's called the Leveson Inquiry, it's named after this guy, Lord Justice Leveson. He was the judge who was appointed to make this independent inquiry into press ethics. That's why it's called the Leveson Inquiry. That's his second name. And here's a picture here of Steve Coogan, Hugh Grant, and Max Mosley. These two are people who were affected by the phone hacking. Well, these three were people who were affected by the phone hacking scandal. We'll come on to this guy in a second. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these contexts in detail now, starting with the economic context. Time to make some notes into your appropriate heading. So economically, the newspaper industry is in decline. It's facing dual challenges of how the increased competition from the internet news, and also the challenge of how to monetize content in a digital age. So there's huge challenges to the newspaper industry. Also, you should know that print revenues are falling, and internet platforms like Facebook and Google monopolize the profits from online advertising. So, 2/3 of all online advertising go to either Facebook or Google. The Daily Mail now makes more revenue from the Mail Online through digital advertising than it does for its print advertising. Economically, the newspapers have had to invest and adapt to compete with changeable expectations of audiences like yourself who are receiving their news from Twitter and from Facebook. So the newspaper industries have had to adapt to you as digital natives. For your information, The Guardian has just recorded its first profit in years. If we have a look at this article here, it suggests that it's broken even for the first time. If you think about 3 years ago, the Guardian was making nearly £60 million of losses per year, which is astonishing, really, in 4 years to be able to turn around and now to have an operational profit. So moving on to political contexts now. The press is seen as the fourth estate. It's an important part of our culture, and it's supposed to underpin democracy and holds the powerful to account. So it's supposed to go the king or the queen, the clergy or the church, and then the people. So after that, then comes the paper. That's how important it is to society. So politically, our social system is a capitalist system, which is a problem really for the newspaper industry. It's a free market economy. So the whole purpose of the paper industry is to make as much or to sell as many papers as possible. And that's why the newspaper industry is dominated by a small number of people, and they're often right wing. It's also why the market needs to be regulated to ensure there are multiple voices. There is plurality, which is necessary for a free press. So, moving on to regulation, talking about free press, how do you regulate a free press? Well, there has always been a close relationship between the press and politicians, and this was criticised by the Leveson Inquiry. And the results of the Leveson Inquiry was that basically the newspaper industry was corrupt and they needed to have greater levels of transparency. After Leveson, there were two regulators set up. One was IPSO, which is an industry body which upholds press standards and maintains the editor's code of conduct. Really importantly now, it isn't fully compliant with the things that the Leveson Inquiry said that an independent press complaints commission should be. So it's not fully Leveson compliant. Impress is another regulator, but it's backed by the state. There are no national papers that are signed up. It tends to be local newspapers that have signed up to Impress. Also, it's primarily funded, yes, by the state, but also by the previous guy that we saw in this picture, Max Mosley. So the people who haven't signed up to Impress say that it can't be transparent. It can't be a proper regulator if it's funded by one person. It's also important to recognise that Max Mosley is the son of Oswald Mosley, the 1930s fascist. So The Guardian haven't signed up to either of them because they claim both regulators are flawed, and instead they have set up their own body to hold the Guardian to account. Okay, moving on to cultural and historical. So British newspapers are a cultural tradition. The industry has been migrating online since the 1980s. There's been a cultural shift, which means that audiences prefer online media and have expectations to have media constantly. Newspapers are part of our common cultural life. And because the ownership is concentrated in a few hands, people the newspapers often have one-dimensional views of British culture, and they can enforce cultural norms and viewpoints. Social and cultural, the way that audiences consume media products has changed, the way that we interact with media products has changed, and the way that we pay for news has changed. And the news reflects what's happening in society and reflects what we are concerned with as a society. So that might be terrorism, that might be the fatigue of Brexit, whatever that might be. So sorry for rushing through that, but hopefully you'll be able to take some notes down, put it on your blog, and make sure your teachers know your blog address so they can check that you are going in the right direction. Good luck!